If you enjoy the content on this channel, please like and subscribe. The Curse of the Chippendales is a 2021 documentary which chronicles the dark side of the 1980s all-male striptease dance troupe. The dancers of the Chippendales captured the hearts, minds and dollars of women in the 1980s with their iconic cuffs and collars and dance routines. As women's liberation collided with new ideas of modern masculinity, this unique moment in history catapulted Los Angeles dance troupe to untold riches and global fame. But as the crowds out front skyrocketed from hundreds to thousands and the money rolled in, the men behind the phenomena plunged into greed, paranoia and ultimately murder. This documentary series really covers now the true crime behind the scenes, as the businessmen, mainly Steve Banashee, who made these male strippers a household name, fell foul of the curse that befouled the Chippendales. The show was created by Jonathan Chin and Simon Chin, and features wonderful interviews with the actual dancers, most notably the Perfect Man, Michael Rapp, Dan Peterson, Reed Scott and Roger Manesh. It also conducts interviews with the Chippendales lawyer of the time, Bruce Nannon, as well as Candice Mayerson, who was the right-hand lady for Nick DeNoyer, who was the famous choreographer for the Chippendales, as well as the man who created Chippendales in New York and took it on the road, before unfortunately being murdered in 1987. Now, as a true crime documentary, Curse of the Chippendales has it all. An all-male dance troupe famed for erotic strip shows, rising from a modest-sized LA nightclub to the international acclaim. The promise of sex and glitzy sprinkle of celebrity, and their ambitious, ego-driven men striving for ownership of the brand, who inevitably and tragically destroy one another in the end. The show offers fascinating insights into the setting up of the brand and its growing popularity, alongside the more darker crime elements of the story. The history of the Chippendales is one that is truly fascinating and almost hard to believe. Established by Indian-American club owner Steve Banerjee and then promoter Paul Snider, who would of course go on famously to murder his Playboy model girlfriend, actress Dorothy Stratton, and then commit suicide. The story focuses on the mainstreaming and gender dynamics of stripping in the 1980s. The documentary series hits all the right notes in deconstructing its subject matter, using archive footage and talking head interviews rather than having a narrator. I also particularly love the soundtrack, as it uses some pop classics from the era. But it's not just the music that really brings the 70s and 80s aesthetics to life. The show really relies heavily on its sort of retro charms at times. It almost employs a sort of VHS type of style. This of course was an era of disco, flirting and a lot of casual sex. But the series really takes you into the mindset of the late 1970s and then throughout the 80s. Look, in some ways it glamorizes the period, but also adds a little bit of nostalgia, reminding you of what the time would have been like. That, of course, isn't until it reminds you of the dark side as well. The Chippendales were absolutely massive in the 1980s. This was a phenomena of some sorts. It had never been done before. Women had never been entertained in this way, and men had never really stripped on a large scale like this. But this show was less of a strip show and more of an entertainment, burlesque. The archive broadcast and video footage shows vast crowds of female fans screaming and excited. And it almost seems like the Chippendales were everywhere. Talk show hosts invited casual conversations with the audience about the male strippers and women's pleasure, sex, desire, and objectification of the male body. It was almost fascinating to see the roles now reversed, and how representations of sex and sex work had transformed over the decades. In many ways, it was almost seen as a sort of women's liberation movement. Now that women could grab and touch men as long as they were paying, and they could treat men as just mere sexual objects. Of course, though, for the men behind the scenes, most notably Steve Banerjee, it was all about making money, and boy did he make a lot of it. The Chippendale dancers themselves enjoyed the attention too, and the documentary really now goes into detail about particularly Michael Rapp's life, that with his wife, Nancy Dehan, who herself was a model, but of course eventually battled with all the attention her husband was getting nightly. Of course, all the drugs that he would take in affairs didn't help either. These men were adored by their fans, but at a huge cost to their own personal lives. Unfortunately, with shows like this, sometimes they can glamorize the more tragic and violent elements of a story. For example, the death here of Dorothy Stratton is just merely passed over. But look, this show is about the entirety of the Chippendales saga. And the interviews here now with the likes of Michael Rapp really just add another perspective to this fascinating story. With a show like Welcome to the Chippendales, and podcasts like Welcome to Your Fantasy, there is plenty of media now surrounding this absolutely fascinating, intriguing and enigmatic story. This is a story really about a man who had it all. Steve Banerjee had come from basically nothing in India and then turned up and made this fantastic business in America, living the American dream. He partnered with Nick DeNoyer, who who himself made the Chippendales into a bigger and bolder company, but the two could not live together, and unfortunately Steve Banerjee organised his murder in 1987. Amongst arson and other potential murder attempts on rival companies, Steve Banerjee eventually was arrested, where he later committed suicide in jail. All in all, this is truly actually a tragic tale of one man's greed usurping his idea of happiness. The Curse of the Chippendales is a very well made documentary and really will provide you a fantastic insight into this most enigmatic of stories. The interviews alone are absolutely fascinating and the research is well covered, but also it is well paced and the show doesn't overstay its welcome. If you want a more in-depth look at the Chippendale story, I'd highly recommend the podcast Welcome to Fantasy, as it really goes into depth on a lot of the other stories that this show just briefly covers. I would say this is a good complement to Welcome to the Chippendales, the dramatic series that's been recently made. While it maybe could have covered some of the more detailed facts of the saga, Curse of the Chippendales does represent the story in a very easy and passable way. Curse of the Chippendales gets an 8.5 out of 10.